Okay, so I have my plate ready, and I'm working on a little bit smaller plate for camera purposes than I would because these masks are a little bit bigger. So, but I always let my stencils and masks hang off the edge a little. I don't want everything to be very linear, so that's something to consider too. I have my ink pad, which is a StazOn in Midnight Blue. It is a solvent ink, but it will be permanent. And so I'm just going to start inking my pad. You can rub it, you can tap it. Depending on how you apply it, you will get some different textures in the background. Like I said, my plate's very old, so it has a lot of little divots and pieces of things stuck in it and everything else, but I kind of like all that texture and stuff. And what it's going to do, anything that's stuck in or on the plate, like this here, is going to give me a negative space when I pull that print. So just so you can get a really good idea, I'm going to try to ink it up really well, and then I'm going to start placing my masks on the plate. So I'm going to let some of them hang off because I want to add a few. Let me start with this one. I just sort of gently place them on. I can tap them down later, plus the plate will help me. The ink dries rather quickly, so I want to move fairly quickly while I do it. And then let me grab this little one here and come down here. So that gives you an idea of the placement. And then I would just take a sheet of copy paper. That's what I'm using today. You can use your hands, you can use a burnishing tool, you can use the back of a spoon. When I'm working larger, I will use a brayer or something, but with masks, I really like to use my fingers because I can get into all the little fine grooves and details to make sure I'm pressing through those areas to get a nice clean image. So I'll do that, and then you can always lift a corner to see if you're pulling up most of the ink. So here is our print. It looks super cool, kind of like a sun print. You can see where I went. I didn't do a very good job of lining up my paper, but you get the idea where some of these went off. So if I were to trim this nicely and then mat it, you could see that it would look better than just being centered on the page. So now I can come back in with pens and pencils and make detailed lines in my leaves. I can add marks to the centers of my flowers. Depending on what substrate I pulled this print with, I could fill in with acrylic or watercolor and get some really interesting things. So this in itself is something I can work with. But the second step of that is to remove these gently. I like to lift and pull in one direction, and I'm going to set those aside and clean them right away. And you can see, or hopefully you can see on camera, that it's leaving a beautiful outline of all of that detail work. So you can see that pretty print. It's a little difficult to see on camera. And now I'll let that ink dry a couple minutes, and then I'll come in and put paint on the plate and pull that print. Okay, so now my ink should be dry, so I'm going to come in with a little paint. This is Chroma's paint, yellow oxide, and I'm just going to put a little in the middle here. And it is a learning curve to find out how much paint you need, but you just have to experiment. You don't want it to be super thin, and you want to make sure your brayer rolls. But you definitely don't want the paint to be too thick either. So I'm going to work pretty quickly because I want it to be fairly sheer. And here is a piece I can roll my brayer off on, and then I will quickly pull the print. And again, I'll just use my hands to kind of make sure I am getting all the way up to the edges. And then once you've burnished it well, you can take a peek underneath and make sure it is pulling the paint up, and then slowly work your paper off the plate. We're getting a nice clean pull this time. So that's really good. It can be bad. I'll give you a tip. Sometimes if it's getting everything, it tends to want to take some of your paper too. So just work really slowly, pulling it off. And you get a really interesting print. Now, if you have a really old plate like mine, you may pull up a ghost of another color that was there, but I'm okay with that. What I like is that really interesting old world feel and look that you get with these prints. And I could repeat that step over and over and layer those marks, but for me, I usually move on and paint this image out or come back in and add a lot more detail with lines. So let's try one more technique. For our second technique, let's go ahead and give that alcohol a try, that alcohol ink. So I'm gonna go ahead and place a mask on the plate, and I might even add another little one here. Maybe just a couple little leaves on the side here. And then I'm gonna take some inks. I just have an assortment of colors that will work well together. And I'm gonna start placing the ink into some of the openings of the flowers. Not too much rhyme or reason right now, just adding some colors together that might work. For the most part, I'm trying to stay within the mask, but it's okay if it goes outside of that. And depending on how picky you are about your colors mixing, you can use the tip of your ink to mix and pool the colors you're working with. So those colors were Sunshine Yellow and Watermelon, and this is Caramel. And I'm just kind of filling in some of the bigger openings on the flowers. And it's okay if you take your time, because we want this to dry thoroughly before we touch it, so you don't have to rush through the application process, because your mask is not going to move until you actually have let all of the ink dry. So this is an aqua color, and I'm actually going to drop a little bit of the caramel into that as well. And then I'm going to come in with a couple greens for the leaves. I have meadow and I have citrus. And you do want to make sure all of your little mask parts are kind of flattened out there. Whoops! You really don't want it to move if you can help it, but sometimes if it's not suction to your plate, that'll happen. I'm okay with it because I'm okay with a little bit of surprise results in all of the art I do, but you could have made sure everything was flattened tight to the plate before you started. Oh goodness, that one leaf doesn't want to stay flat. We're going to get something really cool around that, I can tell. So now one thing I do want to show you is you could leave this entirely free of color because your mask is solid berries there, or I'll show you on one little part here, you can come in around it. I'll just do these bottom two and see if it will work to show you, to give it a little bit of shadowing of color there. So I would let all of that dry. It kind of looks like a stained glass window as it's drying. I would let all of that dry with the mask on it completely, and then I'll come back in and peel it off and do the next step. Okay, so my ink is mostly dry, and I've gone ahead and peeled off my masks and cleaned those off camera. I wanted to point out something that I did on purpose that I know you're gonna have a question about, is why I didn't ink around my stems like I did around these berries. Well, twofold answer is, one, I wanted to show you what it looked like working around a solid part of the mask, so something without a lot of detail like these open leaves. And depending on how much seeps under the mask will dictate how delineated those lines are. So in between where I added it manually here, it was great, and I purposely put it very close to the edge here, knowing that stencil was partially lifted, and it went under, and then my mask rather went under my mask, and it kind of suctioned it back to the plate and gave me an imprint of that. So I may have to show you one other thing because that gave me a thought, but here I didn't do that. So this leaves it open for the artist. I can come back in with a paint pen. I can come back in with my stencil or mask and add another line to create the stems that were there. Or I can come back in and add the sketchy lines after the fact, which is what I really love to do. So I'm going to show you real quick what would happen if you just lay a little bit of this ink down and put the mask right over it. Let's go ahead and add a little here. I just want enough to create a landing place for the berries on this one mask so you can see how it will work if you were to lay all your ink down first and then lay your mask down. So I'm just going to add part of this mask in that area. I'll go ahead and put this little stem of berries right over the top there. This is dry, so that'll be fine, and we'll see how that presents when it dries. So you can see where I pulled this one off, it did work well. Let's check this one out that I tried. I went ahead and added one up here that had some openings in it. So I placed the ink down just like here, laid the mask over it, let it dry, and very, very cool results. So you can see there's some differences. Now let's go ahead and pull this print and see what we get. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a little white paint to the plate. And this is a heavy-bodied paint. And I'm going to go ahead and brayer that all around. You may see a little bleed from the alcohol ink come through. That's pretty typical. Pulling off a little of the extra paint as I go. So I want this to be fairly sheer, but not dry. Like I said, it takes some practice to get the right thickness of paint to pull a print. And it changes all the time for me. Okay, I'm gonna put this down, burnish it really well. And remember, this is the example I showed you that was not perfect in nature. The lines and the crisp edges aren't as present when you use the alcohol ink. So let's see what we get here. And we get a really nice print. So you can see there's a lot of potential here to come back in with a pastel pencil or a pen of some sort and start creating and sketching in your own lines and that sort of thing. So I just think it's a really super cool technique, and I hope you had fun with these. And if you share on social media, be sure to tag me on Instagram at Rae Missigman. I would love to see what you're doing and compliment you on what I am sure is amazing work. So have fun with these new stencils and masks, and as always, happy creating.